here's what I want to do at this point. Let me get to the presentation on Jane Austen. And this was a presentation I did at a professional meeting. I was going to change it slightly for you guys, but I'm not. I'm going to use it the same. I actually presented this down in New Orleans, Louisiana, back in March. Let me see if I can get this full thing on. Yeah, I need to go back. Let me go back. So you can get this, the size right here. Can you read all that? Why is this not all showing up? Let's see. Well, let me just start with this. You getting this? Oh yeah, we can see all this. I bet a lot of you are aware that economics often gets paired with other disciplines. What would be an example of, for you here?
Wes.
Wes, yeah, Wes. What would be a discipline economy get paired with?
Well, I'm interested in like how it relates with psychology and like behavioral economics.
Yeah, a lot of people are interested in that. There's economists that study psychology and psychologists that study economics, a lot of interaction here. Another place where you get a lot of interaction is in law. We have a whole law and economics course in a curriculum. There's a whole area of law and economics. Anybody think of other areas where there's some pairing with econ and another discipline? Yeah.
Like a GDP and employment could be factored into the stock market.
Oh yeah. Econ. All the business disciplines pair up with econ. You know, you really can't do accounting and the final analysis without some econ. And you certainly can't do finance without econ. That's for sure. In marketing, management, all those areas end up using it. And law will use it. The environmental folks use it. In the environmental sequence, if you're going to get a degree in environmental studies, usually most places have to take one, sometimes two econ courses. And it all makes sense. One place where there's not a whole lot of interaction, scholarly or pedagogical in any other way, is between literature, which they teach in the English department, and economics. Very little interaction. As a matter of fact, a joke, a story I can tell. Many years ago, not that long ago, 15 years ago, a young man, a young assistant professor named Alex Tabarrok was here. And Tabarrok is the author with Tyler Cowen, a bunch of stuff, and he's gone on to do greater things. He's at George Mason University, PhD program, all that. He's just got a ton of books. Real interesting guy. It was really a pleasure to have him. And anyway, we had a cocktail party over our house for the econ department. We invited a number of other people. It was sort of a nice kind of thing to do a college setting. And one of our friends, Dr. Irene Goldman, who was an English professor, was there. And she introduces herself to Tyler Cowen and asks her, not Tyler Cowen, but to Alex Tabarrok, and introduces herself, and they talk about things. And she starts going, oh, so you teach economics. What kind of economics are you interested in? And so he says public choice. And she says, well, does anybody in your department teach Marxist economics? To which Alex responds, says, oh no, we let you people in the English department do that. Which, yeah, they kind of have a perspective that's very different than ours. There's not a lot of interaction between economists and people that are literature professors. Not much, but there is some. And I got interested in this with a colleague of mine, Michelle Backers, that I actually met at the Liberty Fund conference, and we actually wrote a paper on this. What you find happening is that every 10 years or so, in some major journal, there will be an article about a piece of literature in economics. One of them in the 1990s was in the Journal of Political Economy. It was about the Wizard of Oz and monetary policy. Now, believe it or not, there's a whole discussion in economics about the Wizard of Oz. Does the wizard represent silver standard? Is the yellow brick road the gold standard? All this stuff is there. It's really kind of interesting. In 2000, there was something on Gulliver's Travels. So every 10 years ago, every now and then, someone's done something on that. McCloskey, and many of you might know who he was Don McCloskey, he's not Deidre McCloskey, okay, that's one. But he's very interested in literature and economics, and the thing he argues is that scientists, oh, can I talk about that? I don't know, am I violating some rule talking about science and economics? I'm not. But after all said and done, scientists should get off their flippant high horse and admit that what they do is tell stories. And that ultimately what economics really constitutes, you can put it in fancy formal equations, but ultimately what you're doing is you're telling a story. It's not that much different than what goes on in literature. Another one says sort of the same thing. Tyler Cowen, who's a friend of Alex Tabarrok, has argued if you actually look at the structure of an economic model, What is it? Well, it's a story. It's saying this is how things work. Look at a novel. What's a novel? A novel is a story that you might be able to model. That's what happens in every novel. You have sort of an equilibrium setting, and then you shock the equilibrium. Something happens and things start occurring. People start changing their behavior. Stuff occurs. And so he says there's a lot more commonality between models and novels than you might suspect. And that's a point we sort of dug up. That's kind of interesting. Another person, Watts, not Tyler Watts down the road, but Tyler Watts actually down the road over at Purdue, not Tyler Watts, but Michael Watts, who's a senior professor over at Purdue, actually putting together for pedagogical purposes a great big book called The Economist Book of Literature. And what he does is something I think is just fascinating. I'd love to teach a principles class at the honors level or some level on this. He goes through just dozens of different novels and show how passages in them illustrate economic concepts. So he'll use something like consumer surplus. Here's something where we know the big gain that someone had. And to me, it's just fascinating. That's one of the things Michelle and I got interested in. We went to a conference where we were reading a couple of American novels with economists, literature people, political scientists. And Michelle and I, who met at that conference, began to kick this all around. That was interesting. And Mike Watts has done a lot on this, so there's some of that there, one way or another. So there is some interaction, very little, but some interaction between economists and literature folks. And you might say, well, why in the world would you be interested in this, aside from, well, it's just one of those things to check off. There was a scholar back in 1948 whose name was, I believe, pronounced it Adelet, something like that. He was a historian that was well background in economics. He understood economics. He did economic history. And he argued that one of the best things you can do with novels are not going to give you actually the data of economic history. If you read in Dickens that somebody paid 13 shillings for a pint of ale somewhere, who knows whether that's accurate or not. That's probably not a good source in a historical sense. But what novels can give you is not so much the history of facts, but the history of people thinking. That if you read what Dickens was saying, maybe he's a pretty good reflection of what folks were thinking in the 1850s about the Industrial Revolution or other things that were going on. And to me, that kind of makes sense. Now, why should economists be interested in what people are thinking? Well, it seems to me there's a whole vein of literature that David McCloskey's added to, Tyler Cowen has too. There's another economic historian, Joel McKeer, who's argued that much of the rise of the Western world and our high living standard depends obviously on our institutions. And what are institutions? The rules, the structures, the laws. In fact, we have stable property rights, which in other parts of the world we don't have that. That's one of the reasons why the Western world, Europe ended up growing more. Well, what's that all predicated on? It is predicated on these attitudes, these opinions. Joel McKeer has a whole book where he argues the key to the Industrial Revolution were critical changes in thinking that occurred roughly during the time of the Enlightenment. And I think there's something to that. If you look at a free, responsible society, a society of free and responsible individuals, I think there's certain attitudes that work well there. And if you don't have it, it doesn't work very well. If you've got the attitudes, it does work very well. And so ideas, I think, matter. And so sketching the history of ideas and seeing how things work out, I think is a very interesting sort of intellectual pursuit. It's kind of a blend between philosophy and economics. But I think it also matters for the real economy. Things are going to matter that way. So, okay, what am I doing in this study? In this study, what we're doing is we're looking at Adam Smith and Jane Austen's use of the phrases self-command, sense, and sensibility. And what am I comparing? I'm comparing Adam Smith's use of these concepts and these phrases, these words, in his Theory of Moral Sentiments and Jane Austen's book, Sense and Sensibility. How in the world did I ever make this connection? I want to tell you it's completely an accident. What happened is in 2009, I got invited to a Liberty Fund conference up in Indianapolis. And it was about Adam Smith, and we read some Wealth of Nations, we read a whole bunch of Theory of Moral Sentiments. I cracked Theory of Moral Sentiments a little bit in graduate school and a little bit on my own. I never really quite understood it. It seemed sort of strange compared to Wealth of Nations. But in this one, I actually read it, and I looked at it, and I thought it was really kind of interesting. And I went to the Liberty Fund seminar to talk to it, and I sat down. The person who was right next to me was a guy named Vernon Smith. Who knows who Vernon Smith is? Who is Vernon Smith? Anybody know? He won a Nobel Prize in economics. So I'm sitting next to this guy that won a Nobel Prize, and gee, that's kind of cool, you know? And he's talking about Adam Smith, he knows what he's talking about, and he kind of tutors us all in the theory of moral sentiments, as do several other people. So I really got interested in the theory of moral sentiments. I went to another Liberty Fund conference around the same topic. We taught a colloquium here on campus on the same topic, and I would maybe get a grant to bring in Peter Betke, who can be arguably an Adam Smith scholar, and Maria Paganelli, who's an Adam Smith scholar that I met at the conference, to do some detailed presentations of Adam Smith during moral sentiments around campus. We did this several years ago, and it was quite successful. Let's say, after doing this for 2.5 years, between 2009 and approximately 2011, I was pretty much up on my Adam Smith theory of moral sentiments. I kind of understood it, had been. That's interesting, good thing to know. And in the summer of 2011, I did something that I'm not really prone to do, but I did. I actually got myself technologically sophisticated. I bought a Nook, okay? And when I bought a Nook, I thought, this is cool. I can read by the pool, et cetera, and it's electronic, and this is cool. They gave me a little, diskette that's got the 100 greatest works of literature. I thought, well, good, that's good. That's what professors should do. If they're stuck on a desert island and all they have is electricity, they should read all this stuff. And okay, it's time to start it. Where do you start? I'll start with the A's, and that's Jane Austen. I'll start with her first novel. Her first novel, Sense and Sensibility. I opened up that, and I thought, she's using the same language Adam Smith is. My gosh, is this overlap incredible. You don't walk around and say, oh, I have a high degree of self-command today, do you? No, that's not common English language now. But it's all through Adam Smith in Theory of Moral Sentiments, and it was just chock full of Sense and Sensibility. I thought, what's going on here? What's this? Is there a link between this? And what I'm going to try to convince you of is yes, in the final analysis, in Sense and Sensibility, what Jane Austen is really doing, she's channeling Adam Smith. His theory of moral sentiments shows up in Sense and Sensibility. And it seems to me this is fascinating. Well, before we get into this, we need to have some definitions, and definitions that are generic to the time frame. In the English language, like I suppose in every language, words change in the way they're used. Like I say, self-command is not a word we usually use. We do sometimes use the word self-control, okay? You've got good self-control. And what we mean by that is the same thing self-command meant. It meant self-control, especially in regard to your emotions and your passions, right? And again, self-control is something, as Adam Smith said, we're start when we go to kindergarten. As soon as we're around other kids, we begin in that great school of self-command. You think about it, you're a little kid, a baby, you do whatever you want. First thing your parents tell you, some self-control. And the first thing you end up learning, self-control. How do you control yourself? You just scream and yell and holler when you want stuff, but you learn pretty early you're not supposed to do that. And when you hang around other kids, you find you're not supposed to do that either. Self-command is sort of central to any society, and self-command is what Adam Smith talks about. Here's another word, sensibility. What it doesn't mean is, you should wear sensible shoes when you go on the field trip because you don't want to wear high heels because they'll hurt at the end of the day. That's not what we mean by sensibility. Sensibility in Adam Smith's time meant the capacity for refined emotion, delicate sensitivity and taste, readiness to feel compassion and suffering of other people. If you have sensibility, what that means is I understand what Lucas is going through when he got his face slapped. Right? And I'll empathize with them well, and I'll understand that. And I'll say the right things at the right time, in the right place. To be sensibility means you can go to the art museum and you really get a lot out of it. Okay? You have this refined capacity to feel compassion and suffering for other people. You have refined emotions. You have taste. And what sense means? Sense means pretty much the same thing now as it did then. Prudence and good judgment. That's what it's all about. Now, what can we say? Jane Austen's very first novel, the very first one she ever published, was called Sense and Sensibility. We'll get to this in a minute, but at this point, what I want to turn our attention to is Theory of Moral Sentiments. One of the things I like about Adam Smith is he usually tells you very early on what he's up to. That's true in Wealth of Nations. It's also true in Theory of Moral Sentiments. Very early on in Theory of Moral Sentiments, in the first book, the first chapter, the fifth subchapter, and the fifth paragraph, he ends up sort of making a conclusion after the first 20 pages of what it's all about. He says, virtue. You don't think about that when you think about Adam Smith or economics, do you? But that's exactly what Adam Smith was talking about. He was talking about virtue. What was it? And what he ended up saying is the following, that to feel much for others and little for ourselves, that to restrain our selfish and to indulge our benevolent affections constitutes perfection in human nature. I want you to look at that and think about that. What's he saying? He's given us a very simple but very profound theory of moral sentiments. Right? That's the whole idea. What's the good person? The good person is somebody that can restrain their selfishness. Everybody's selfish. Smith would say that. He doesn't say selfishness is good, despite what some people have you believe. Smith never said that. He never said that. He recognized selfishness was selfishness. But to restrain our selfishness and to be able to indulge our benevolent affections, that is to look at the other person's position, understand it, and put it in, and to expand that constitutes moral perfection. That's what he says. That's theory of moral sentiments. That's what he starts out with. He fleshes this out a little bit more, and here's what I think is incredibly interesting. Little later on, this is the very next section, 1156, what was before was 1155, so this is the very next paragraph. He says, so the virtues of sensibility, that is, being sensitive to other people, and self-command are not apprehended to consist of the ordinary, but in the uncommon degree of these qualities. Now look at this, as I understand this is very Aristotelian, but it's true. Virtue is excellence, something uncommonly great and beautiful, which rises far above that which is vulgar or ordinary. The amiable virtues consist of that degree of sensibility which surprises by its exquisite and unexpected delicacy and tenderness. If Arthur tells me his brother has broken his leg, and I say, oh, I'm sorry to hear that, that's sort of common. Everybody would say that. But if somehow or another I say something exactly that hits the spot and says it in a way that is elegant, says it in a way that's very sensitive, because I know Arthur and I know something about him, that constitutes virtue. It's when you're sensible in a way somebody else is pain and suffering, in a way that surprises by its unexpected delicacy and tenderness. The awful and respectable in that degree of self-command. Now again, self-command is a virtue too, but when's it really something that's praiseworthy? When it's really a virtue is when it astonishes us by the amazing superiority over the most ungovernable passions of human nature. That's what he's saying. Virtue is what? Virtue is kind of the extreme. And there's sort of two poles on it. One pole on it is, can I really feel for the other person? The other pole, can I constrain myself? Something terrible happens to me, but I'm obligated to do something. I go ahead and do it. I don't make a big fuss about it. I've got self-command, self-control. My leg's blown off, and I'm still in command as a commander. Adam Smith says, no big deal. The commander gets his finger cut a little bit, and you still kind of have your shit together. That's okay. What's really impressive is if you have your act together when terrible things have offered. Now look at this word here, sensibility, self-command. These are my emphasis. But this is the core of what Smith's talking about. He's talking about sensibility, self-command. This is kind of his theory of good behavior. Good behavior is what? Constraining yourself, putting yourself at the bottom, and being able to look at the other guy and understand what he's doing and accommodating that. And it's doing this very well that constitutes the virtuous life, and that's the point. Well, what can I say? Smith, and again, I have a class that I'm teaching online through Students for Liberty that's graduate students from around the country. And this is a lot of fun because we're reading all this and talking about it, so we just talked about this last night. Self-command, how do we get self-command? The way you get self-command is you go through adversity. And who's the folks that are likely to have the best self-command? It's the people that have been bred in the great school of self-command, in the bustle of the business world, exposed perhaps to the violence and injustice of factions, to the hardships and hazards of war. These people can maintain this control of your passive feelings upon all occasions. So what's the thing? The unfortunate thing is in order to get self-command, you have to go through bad things. But as you begin to learn about how to go through bad things, your self-command improves, you have more control over yourself, you're in better shape to be able to navigate the things of the world. Well, a lot of families, syndicate in the Army, how come? What does it do? Teaches them discipline, right? That's really what this is. And that's exactly what Smith's talking about in terms of self-command. Another thing he says in terms of this that's fascinating is, okay, bad things happen. What do you do when bad things happen? Well, again, you want to exhibit that self-command. You want to have self-control. Bad things happen to you. Nobody likes the person that sits around and just whines about how terrible everything is all the time. We all know people like that. Oh, things are so bad for me. And all they want to do is complain. The person we really admire is people that are going through tough things, but they can hold up and they continue on, according to Smith. And he says, hey, this is something straightforward. You're in great grief. You're in adversity. Are you in adversity? Do not mourn in the darkness of solitude. Do not regulate your sorrow according to the indulgent sympathy of your intimate friends. Don't just go whine to your friends. Return as soon as possible to the daylight of the world and of society. Live with strangers, with those who you know nothing or care nothing about your misfortunes. What's his argument? It's very straightforward. What should you do if you're really, really upset about things? A terrible thing happens, some terrible happened to your brother. Don't sit around whining about it too long. Get out and start talking to people and carry on. And you think about that's right. What do families always do? If you know somebody in an intimate situation and someone's died, tragedies happen, what do people do? They go over and visit them. That's the thing to do because it helps them get in a position where they have to put up and they have to get out of their grief a bit. It's sort of embedded, it seems, universally in social customs. Well, this is just a very brief sketch of what Adam Smith's sort of moral theory is. And it's a very profound theory. I argue it's perfectly consistent with what he ends up doing in Wealth of Nations, but that's another story. At this point, we get a picture of what Adam Smith was saying in 1753 when he wrote his book, Theory of Moral Sentiments. And by the way, one of the things we found, and I know this is true, when we went up to Indianapolis last trip, there was a guy that actually has copies of Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments, the original ones, and copies of original edition 1 versions of Wealth of Nations. We're trying to persuade him for a fee to lend these to Ball State, and in the spring of 2015 we may have an Adam Smith, shall I say, celebration with all these things. The point was, what did Smith think was his most important work? Wealth of Nations? No. He always said and continually refined his Theory of Moral Sentiments. He thought that was his most important work, and he thought that was the most interesting. And again, economists are rediscovering that. Well, let's now go to something else. What have we got? Let's turn our attention now to Jane Austen. Jane Austen published Sense and Sensibility, 1811. That's going to be 58 years after Smith wrote Theory of Moral Sentiments. And if you look at the story, it's a typical Jane Austen story. Anybody here read much Jane Austen? Anybody read some of it? Actually, it's a lot of fun. It's just a great read. It's really good. It's 200 years old, but it's very entertaining. And if you take it lightly, it's funny. She makes jokes. She does all kinds of things. The novel was actually fairly new, as I understand. And the idea that middle-class people would buy books and read them, this was coming along during this time frame. And Jane Austen was one of the first successful authoresses out there. And her stories are all about these impoverished aristocratic girls that are trying to get married. That's the whole story. Well, what does an impoverished aristocratic girl have to look forward to in her life in England in 1811? Get married. That's about it. And what do you want to marry? You want to marry a guy with high status and with a lot of money. So that ends up being there. So that's part of what's going on here. Here are two girls who are part of a family. Their father died long. It's a long, involved story, but let's get into it. One of the older girls, and she's supposed to be 19. Who's that? Who's that actress? Yeah, it's Emma Thompson. Emma Thompson's not 19. They had to put a lot of makeup on. She doesn't look 19, but that's what she's supposed to be. She's Eleanor Dashwood. And in the novel Sense and Sensibility, she's in love with this guy, Edward Ferrars. What's that actor? Hugh Grant. Yeah, that's exactly. Yeah, that's Hugh Grant. And the story is Eleanor Dashwood, Edward Ferrars are kind of in love with each other. And Ferrars is kind of an adult. He's not very sharp. He's not very confident. His family wants him to move up in the world, get Parliament. He doesn't want to do that, okay? And she ends up getting jilted by him. Of course, that's the worst thing that happened to a young lady in 1811. A man is really interested in you, and everybody thinks you're going to get married to him, and then he disappears, goes off with somebody else. Gosh, that's awful. her sister, Mary Ann Dashwood, is supposed to be 17. I have no idea who that actress is either, or that actor. She's in love with a guy named John Willoughby. And Willoughby is dashing, handsome, confident, a man of the world, somebody everybody would look up to. And she's just really nuts over him, and he's acting like he's nuts over her, etc., etc. And she ends up getting jilted by Willoughby. So for both of these young ladies, there's disaster in their life that happens for a young, poor, aristocratic girl of that time frame. What can we say? Early on, Austen ends up outlining the characters, both Mary Ann and Eleanor. One of them can be truly linked to sense, the other to sensibility. Now again, remember the difference. Sense constitutes common sense, it means prudence. Sensibility constitutes what? It constitutes, oh, I'm very delicate in my feelings, I'm so emotional, and I'm so wonderful and all this stuff, and I sort of feel things greatly. Here's what Austen says on page 33, and this is very early on in the novel. Eleanor had an excellent heart. Her disposition was affectionate. Her feelings were strong, but she knew how to govern them. It was knowledge her mother had yet to learn, and which one of her sisters had resolved never to be taught. So what's Eleanor? Eleanor's this very prudent young lady, and she's got a lot of self-command. We'll see that come up later. What's Mary Ann? Mary Ann's abilities were in many respects quite equal to Eleanor's. She was sensible and clever, but eager in everything. Her sorrows, her joys could have no moderation. She was generous, amiable, interesting. She was everything but prudent. Okay? So we get a picture of these two young ladies and where they're at. I argue it's not hard to pull this out. Eleanor is the essence of self-command. You take the Smithian virtue of self-command, it's embodied in Eleanor. Upon leaving Norland, which is kind of the estate they're all living at, Edward, remember that's the guy she's hot over, and he's hot over here, he leaves, okay, and he's not going to come back and see her, and she knows that. What happens? Her sister Mary Ann knows. Even now, Eleanor's self-command, that's from Austen, her self-command is invariable. When is she dejected or melancholy? When does she try to avoid society or appear restless or dissatisfied in it? That's on page 64. You move on out as the story continues. Fascinating. Ends up what Eleanor and Mary Ann come in touch with. They end up coming in contact with the Steele sisters. And the Steele sisters are very vulgar, uneducated, sort of rubes that run into a lot of money, sort of nouveau riche people that know what the hell they're doing. Okay? And what can I say? She learns from Lucy Steele that it's Lucy that has a secret engagement to her boyfriend, but when she really likes Edward. So here it is, man you're interested in, thinking they still be interested in you, and this sort of vulgar girl comes up and says, I want to tell you a secret, guess what? I'm really engaged to this guy, Edward. Well, what happens, that's going to be breaking your heart. That'll tear you up if you're 19 years old. Here's what Austen has her doing. Eleanor was silent. Eleanor's security sunk, but her self-command did not sink with it. She held up, she went on. She didn't go babbling off to people or do anything. As a matter of fact, she doesn't tell anybody about this. She doesn't tell anybody about this until page 259. Later on in the novel, she finally informs her sister that she's been jilted by Edward. And again, look at Austen's description of this. Her narration was clear and simple, and though it could not be given without emotion, yeah, I just lost the love of my life, I'm going to have some emotion about this, it was not accompanied by violent agitation or impetuous grief. What's Eleanor? She's this model of self-control, this model of self-command, straight out of Smith. She's always interested in what other people are feeling, and she holds back things that are happening to her. Now, see what happens with her sister. Mary Ann has absolutely no self-command. When she first meets Willoughby, who's this hot, dashing guy who ends up being a fraud, he's hot and dashing, and she's really interested in him. Eleanor notes that only when it's happening, all social events, is Mary Ann and Willoughby are just going off and they're doing their own thing, and they don't pay attention to anybody. And Eleanor tells her, I wish you didn't openly show this. She wishes that it were less openly shown, and once or twice did suggest the propriety of, here's that word again, self-command to Mary Ann. You need some self-command, sister. You look like a fool. You're out there just flaunting your stuff with this guy. Everybody's going to get the wrong impression. But Mary Ann abhorred all concealment. And she said, Willoughby thought the same thing. Oh, no, we're going to be showing ourselves all around. We love this. We don't want any self-control here, any self-command. As a matter of fact, as you continue on, what you have is not only does Mary Ann not show any self-command, she consciously says she thinks self-command is stupid. When Eleanor acts as if nothing had happened, when Edward ends up leaving, and busily employs herself the whole day, what's Mary Ann's reaction? We saw it earlier. She said, yeah, she's got a bunch of self-command, but she also says, such behavior as this, so exactly the worst of her own, appeared no more meritorious to Mary Ann than her own had seemed faulty to her. The business of self-command she settled very easily with strong affections that was impossible. Oh, I can't control myself. That's really showing how sensible you are, you know? If you don't sit there and have a hissy fit, it means you really don't care. Self-command is not something a good thing. And with calm ones, it has no merit. So not only does Mary Ann not exhibit self-command, she thinks self-command is stupid. And here's what happens. When Mary Ann gets jilted, she behaves in an entirely different way. She's in London. She finds out through a bunch of things that her lover, Willoughby, doesn't like her at all. As a matter of fact, he's going to marry this rich, fat chick. That's what he's going to do, okay? And she's absolutely crushed about it. Well, what's she do? She pines and she mourns and she screams. She stays in bed all day. She won't go out and do anything. She has these fits of gloom and grief that go on for weeks on end. And she makes herself miserable and everybody around her miserable. That's what she ends up doing. And how does it all work out? Well, she actually does physically get sick and darn near dies, but she recovers from it because her sister takes care of her. And ultimately, her sister, Eleanor, tells her about the fact, yeah, Eleanor, I've been jilted. But eventually, Mary Ann doesn't take self-command. Ultimately, she goes back home, and eventually she gets over her illness, and then Mary Ann has a calmness of spirit, straight from Austen, page 329, and apparent composure of mind. And Mary Ann reveals, I have formed my plan, and am determined to enter into a course of serious study. I'm going to stop screwing around. I'm going to learn to play the piano well. I'm going to learn things. I'm going to get over all this. She gets some self-command. She learns from it. Also, I think you could argue, and again, one literary critic says this, that the whole story of Sense and Sensibility is Eleanor, who's the very sense one, the one with a lot of self-command, actually develops her sensibility a bit. Upon, in the final story, hearing Ferrars was available for marriage, it ends up that Lucy Steele, awful person, she ends up faking that engagement to get out of it. She almost ran out of the room. As soon as the door was closed, burst into tears of joy. A literary critic ended up saying the joy was not less intense because Eleanor remembered that ladies do not run and that they always shut the door. But Eleanor's sense involves much more than prudent reticence and regard for social form and decorum. These may be its surface expressions, but it's, in essence, its fidelity toward inward discrimination of both the heart and head. Ian Watts was a literary critic that wrote that. What I find myself doing is reading a lot of literature, and a lot of literary critics talk about this. The thing I think is just so interesting, can you buy my argument that she's channeling Adam Smith? It's the story to a T. His moral theory is sense, sensibility. His moral theory is self-control, absence of self-control. And these players are playing it like a fiddle. And to me, that's just amazing. Well, read a little bit farther, what you find out is almost certain. Jane Austen read Adam Smith. She read it. She came from an educated family. Her father was a minister. She grew up around educated people. They had a big library. And we know that book, Theory of Moral Sentiments, was there. And that she was a very precocious young lady. She read a lot. She certainly was exposed to this. But it seems to me so interesting. Look at this time frame and look at what virtue is considered to be. I think it's interesting. It seems to me if you have a society where people aspire to that, you maybe get results that are a little different than if people don't aspire to that. People who regard other folks and can kind of put their passions on the sideline and continue with their business, seems to me those are productive people who make things happen in the world. People who are constantly moaning about how terrible things are themselves and constantly in misery, you know, they're probably not employees and they'd be very very good in your organization? Yeah, exactly, right. What can you say? It seems very straightforward. This is sort of, both these things I think are sort of foundations of what people would possibly call the bourgeois virtues, that I think are absolutely necessary for economic development. And to me, this is a very interesting study. As I was telling Arthur, it ends up my co-author and I, Michelle Bacris, yesterday submitted a proposal to a book company to write a book about all this. So we'll see where that ends up going. But I think this is a lot of fun. And it's kind of this intersection between philosophy, literature, and economics. And I really learned a lot out of it. And hope you got something out of it. Thanks for listening. I appreciate that. Or questions? Anybody have any questions or comments or insights or? Yeah.
Does Jane Austen channel Adam Smith and her other works as well?
That's part of what we're looking at. Yeah, that's part of what we're looking at. Is that Emma, if you've ever seen that one or that novel, Emma doesn't have a whole lot of self-control. And it's interesting to see how that works out. Michelle's been working on that and putting our finger, we'll put that together. Other themes we might look at is how Adam Smith thinks of business, how Jane Austen thinks of business, how they're portraying a variety of other things that are there. And again, a question I raised to the group last night, is this just old-fashioned stuff and that we all are much better in touch with our emotions now, and that what Adam Smith was calling for was this sort of stiff upper lip British thing where nobody has any contact with their own emotion, we're all a bunch of neurotics because we all repress ourselves? I don't think so. I think if you read through Smith carefully, he's really giving, I think, a very viable, shall I say, social psychology, almost philosophy of life. Remember, back then, there wasn't a distinction between an economist, a psychologist, and a philosopher, right? It was all sort of the same ball of wax, it was just thinkers. And those distinctions came much later. But I think when you look at Smith, especially in theory of moral sentiments, you find a lot of behavioral economics, a lot of really good foundational psychology, a lot of good things under the guise of moral philosophy. There's a book out called Adam Smith and Game Theory, which I have, Jane Austen and Game Theory, which I haven't read, but it's on my reading list, where the author, who's a top-notch young game theorist at Berkeley, I believe, argues that Jane Austen is talking about game theory in her novels, and you use game theory to analyze what's going on. Can't wait to read that, that's going to be a lot of fun. But that's kind of what old professors that have done things for a long time get interested in. These kind of weird little tangents, but I'm having a lot of fun with it, and I think it's really interesting. Other questions? I'd love to have other people ask other things about this. Yeah, Arthur.
So, I can kind of see like the connection between Adam Smith's like this moral theory, and,
Right.
Like it's more like his economic motivations.
Right.
But I feel like there's a bit of a contrast, like in the former part of his moral theory, where he talks about like a heightened sense of sympathy.
Right.
So, like, could you explain briefly like the link between the two?
Yeah, that between Adam Smith, Theory of Moral Sentiments, and Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, the alleged Adam Smith problem. In about 1880, there were some German scholars who wrote Adam Smith is psychotic because what's written in Wealth of Nations, which is emphasizing self-interest, is in contrast with what's written in Theory of Moral Sentiments, which emphasizes this ability to empathize with other folks. That markets are all about selfishness, but Adam Smith's talking in Theory of Moral Sentiments about everybody being nice to each other. Gosh, what's going on here? This guy's an idiot. I don't think it's right. I don't think it's correct at all. And the thing I would link it on is if you go back and you look what Smith ended up saying when he's developing in Theory of Moral Sentiments his perspective, he admits that people are very selfish. As a matter of fact, that's the whole thing he's trying to overcome. And how do you overcome selfishness? Well, you've got this other tendency in the human breast, so to speak, of having affinity for other folks, wanting to get their approval, wanting to live with them, wanting to be well-liked by them, because that's the ultimate point. But we never get perfect at it. And to have that level of perfection where we're benevolent and we really do things for other people because we really have high morals and high ethics, that's not going to happen. Benevolence is virtue, and what's virtue? Virtue is excellence. It's not an ordinary degree of concern for
other people. Benevolence is an extraordinary degree of concern for other people. So you go to Wealth of Nations, what are we going to rely on to get people to do what we want them to do? I want to buy water. You've got water to sell. What am I going to rely on? Am I going to rely on Jordan's benevolence? Well, benevolence is a virtue. He's probably a pretty good guy, but I'm not sure he's that virtuous. Well, he also has, though, self-interest. And if I offer him money for water, I bet he'll give it to me. So which one works better? Yeah, self-interest is something we can rely on. It's not good or bad, it just is the way human beings are. They're going to be self-interested. Tapping the self-interest and getting to be human and to be social, yeah, that's part of life, but you only got that self-interest. And it seems to me that's what he outlines in Theory of Moral Sentiments. That you always have this tension between self-interest and concern for the other. It's got to be in balance. You'll always have this tension between developing your self-command and developing sensibility. That these things all work together. But what can we always rely on? I can always rely on the stranger's sense of self-interest. I can't rely on the stranger's sense of benevolence. Because benevolence is excellence, and excellence is virtue, and most people by definition can't be excellent. So if you set up an economy on the predication everyone's going to be excellent, it's going to fall apart. But if you set an economy based upon, oh, most people are going to have pretty much ordinary virtue, so they'll maintain their contract, they will give you service with a smile, at least at some level, they'll be sort of decent to you in the marketplace. And they'll also be decent if you make it in their self-interest to do it. That kind of economy can work. So again, that's my argument. I think this is a very important point, incredibly important point, that the Germans that read, they must not have read it. That's the argument. Anybody that believes there's a contradiction between Smith and Theory of Moral Sentiments and Smith and Wealth of Nations hasn't read it very carefully. And one of the points I make is a lot of people quote Adam Smith, and how they quote him. I used to do this all the time. You just read through and you find what you like, you pluck it out. Well, Adam Smith says this, oh, I was clever because I quote Adam Smith. But you don't read the stuff that's around it, you really don't understand what he's saying. You don't understand how it fits together. It seems to me the German historical school, we're talking about the Adam Smith problem, hadn't read Adam Smith very carefully. That's my argument. But that's a great question. You really got me off on something I'm very interested in. Yeah, Mike.
I was just going to say, was that German school like the Marxists that were mentioned?
I don't think it was. I don't think they were Marxists. I think they were more the historicists. And I think what they were trying to do is kind of pull Smith down a rung. About 1870, people started saying, oh, this free market stuff doesn't work. We're seeing too many monopolies out there. And you begin to get sort of an erosion of what you might call the classical liberal consensus on limited government. And all of a sudden, government takes a more important role in that. I think that's part of what was going on there. But my argument, and again, I'm not the only one to argue, there's people a lot smarter and a lot more Adam Smith than they're smarter than I am, they've read more Adam Smith and more of the accompanying literature. They're going to say, no, that Adam Smith problem is not really a problem. He is, in fact, incredibly consistent intellectual. And it's so fascinating when you read it. And this is, I realize that this is the 5th time I read through Theory of Moral Sentiments. And I'm just now figuring it out, right? But you see how consistent he is. He'll have this one section, and then the later section, he is tying into what he did in the first section. It all builds on itself. It's just beautiful the way he puts it together. And it's good writing, good thinking is. So that's why I think it's fun. But that's a great question, and again, good ideas. I think the history of thought's fascinating. I'd like to see how these things fit together. I think ideas are a lot of fun. And I also think they matter. So that's my take. Other questions or discussions? I love this. Yeah.
Have you looked at any other books written during this time period that also?
That's a great question, is how other things would end up fitting in. There's a book called Jane Austen and the Enlightenment that I've read at. It's a real thick book written by an English professor. He does a lot of that, other things that are fitting in. And he references Smith quite a bit and says Smith was quite influential in a lot of people's thinking. Of course, what's interesting here, I think we all know that Adam Smith was influential in thinking in terms of Wealth of Nations. What we don't recognize or wouldn't know, especially as economists, is Smith was probably very influential on thinking in moral philosophy. That actually Theory of Moral Sentiments had a great deal of influence on lots of folks over time and probably still has that in there. again, a thing I keep on going back to is this, and you can't help but do it, and you're gonna bounce it around, and you get my online group ends up, you keep on saying, no, he's got something better. Is this just the rantings of an English gentleman of 1850? Roughly saying this is how people ought to be, oh, stiff upper lip, yes, 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 don't show your emotions all that. You know, the sense of that, yeah. But there's another sense of, no, I think he's getting something deeper than that. I don't think he's, I mean, he's obviously culturally bound to England of 1750, yes. We're all culturally bound to where we are. But the question is, does it transcend that? And I think it probably does. Habits of grief and, you know, I don't know any society in the world where people, if they just run around and scream all the time, we think that's good, except maybe on college campuses. Maybe at Berkeley they do that. But like I say, most other places, we don't allow that. You do something with people like that. And you have prescribed times when you can't scream and yell and holler. I mean, there's cultures where you bring in people to mourn at death, to make the mourning more, I don't know, better, right? But we do have controls over this. And this is exactly what he gets into in theory of moral sentiment. What is your proper response to somebody's action? If somebody's showing great grief and they're very upset, what's your response? Well, he ends up arguing, you need to know why they're so upset. If someone comes and says, I'm really pissed off at John Horowitz. I'm really mad at him. You say, okay, Dr. Bohanon, that's fine, interesting. What's the next thing you're going to ask? Well, as soon as you probably say, I don't want to get involved in this, I'm leaving, right? Well, what would be the thing you'd ask? You'd ask, why? And then I'd have to make my case, and my case would be to try to get you to sympathize with my reason for why I'm mad at John. Not John, I'm mad at John, just to be sure of that. But, you know, this kind of thing happens. And it's the same thing. I ask you to encourage me or have sympathy for my success. If I just said, oh, the book contract came through and they gave me a check for $50,000, what's your response going to be, mine?
You're buying me beer?
Yeah, exactly, exactly, Eric, you've done it. And you say, good job, Cecil. Now, what might be going on there, jealousy? He got a book contract, you big shit. I don't like this. Yeah, and that's and Smith talks about all this. He talks about all this. And you don't think of that from the guy that wrote Wealth of Nations that's just talking about people buying and selling. But if you read all the stuff in the foundation, the theory of moral sentiment, and then you read what he says in Wealth of Nations, and you think of one as being the foundation for the other, it all makes a lot more sense. It all fits together. Because he's assuming people are kind of following this pattern. Is Smith outlining a theory of morals that he thinks people ought to follow? Or is he just describing what he thinks people do? To me, that's a fascinating question. Again, that's positive economics, normative economic distinction. Smith, nobody thought about that then. They sort of did because Hume was into that, right? Smith was an empiricist. He was going to look at facts and all that. But there wasn't a strong distinction between positive and normative. But at heart of Smith, he's a very good empiricist. He's a very good empiricist. And he says, look, most people have feelings for other folks. Some psychopaths around, yeah. But most people are going to have some fellow feeling. Most people will know how to disapprove of how somebody behaves. What we made last night in the seminar, I think it's fascinating. What's the biggest constraint on you? Probably not the law. Probably not your own sense of virtue. Probably the biggest constraint on you is not that, oh, I'm going to feel very benevolent if I do this stuff. The biggest constraint on you is the disapproval of all your friends. What if you do something and everybody says, you're just an asshole for doing that? What are you going to do? That's probably a bigger restraint on you than a law that says you can't do it, or some kind of sense of conscience that, oh, I don't want to do that, or some sense of, oh, if I did that, I wouldn't be benevolent. Smith's into all of this. Talks about all the tensions between this. This makes it interesting. So, anyway, I'll stop being so animated myself. I'm not showing self-command, so I'll sit down for a minute. But thanks, folks. I really appreciate this. This is a lot of fun to talk about this. Enjoy it.
Alright, so, if anyone who wants to go on the indie trip hasn't signed up yet, there's, come sign up here. If you can just like give me those surveys.